There comes a moment in every painful relationship when something inside you quietly changes. You stop explaining yourself. You stop defending your feelings. You stop chasing answers, and suddenly you go silent. Not because you stopped caring, but because you finally understood that your love was being used against you. And this is the exact moment a narcissist begins to panic. Carl Jung believed that human relationships reveal hidden psychological battles. And nowhere is this more visible than in the dynamic between a narcissist and someone who truly loved them. Because the narcissist never fears your anger. They never fear your tears. They never fear your questions. What they fear is your silence, because silence means psychological separation. Silence means you are no longer emotionally available for manipulation. Silence means the control they depended on is slipping away. And when you finally go quiet, something terrifying happens inside their mind. They feel abandonment not as sadness, but as loss of power. Because narcissists do not attach through love. They attach through emotional supply. Your attention was their validation. Your reactions were their proof of importance. Every message you sent, every apology you gave, every attempt to fix things told them they still mattered. But when you stop reaching out, when your phone becomes silent, when your energy withdraws, they experience what Jung described as the collapse of the projected self. The image they created using you begins to break. And this creates deep psychological panic. At first, they do not believe your silence is real. They assume you will come back like always. They wait confidently, thinking you are just upset, thinking your emotions will pull you back toward them, because historically, you always returned. You always forgave. You always tried again. But this time something feels different. Days pass, maybe weeks pass, and your silence remains steady, calm, unreactive. And now confusion begins to grow inside them. Because narcissists survive through emotional reactions. They provoke arguments to feel alive. They create drama to maintain control. They push you away just to watch you run back. But when you stop participating in this emotional cycle, the entire psychological structure collapses. Carl Jung explained that individuals who lack a stable inner self rely heavily on external mirrors. And you were that mirror. You reflected importance back to them. You confirmed their identity. You validated their existence. But when you disappear emotionally, they lose the reflection they depended on. And suddenly, they are forced to face an uncomfortable emptiness they have avoided their entire lives. This emptiness is not loneliness. It is identity instability. And this is why silence hurts a narcissist more than rejection. Because rejection still gives emotional engagement. Rejection still allows conversation. Rejection still feeds their need for drama. But silence removes access completely. Silence communicates emotional independence. And emotional independence is the one thing a narcissist cannot tolerate. Because your independence exposes their lack of control. And when control disappears, panic replaces confidence. Many people believe narcissists move on easily, but psychologically, this is rarely true. They may appear unaffected externally. They may post happy pictures, start new relationships quickly, or act indifferent. But internally, they begin scanning for signs of your return. Checking your social media, rereading old conversations, wondering why their usual tactics no longer work. Because your silence breaks the script they expected. And narcissists depend heavily on predictable emotional patterns. Once those patterns change, anxiety rises. Jung described this as confrontation with the shadow. The part of the self they avoid seeing. Your silence forces them closer to that shadow. And instead of self-reflection, they experience fear. Because without external validation, they must face internal insecurity. Something they have spent years avoiding. This is why many narcissists suddenly reappear after long periods of absence, sending casual messages, pretending nothing happened, or acting nostalgic. They are not returning because they suddenly understood your worth. They return because your silence disrupted their psychological stability. They want reassurance that they still have emotional access to you, that they can still influence your feelings, that you are still emotionally connected. And if you respond quickly, even angrily, their panic reduces immediately because engagement restores control. But if your silence continues, something deeper begins to happen. They start questioning their own importance. And this is profoundly uncomfortable for someone whose identity depends on admiration. Carl Jung believed that growth begins when projection ends. And your silence marks the end of projection. You are no longer playing the emotional role assigned to you. You are no longer the rescuer, the fixer, the understanding partner, the endlessly forgiving soul. Instead, you become psychologically unavailable. And this transformation changes the power dynamic completely. Because the person who once chased validation now embodies self-respect. And self-respect is deeply threatening to narcissistic personalities. Because it cannot be manipulated, they cannot negotiate with your silence. They cannot argue with your absence. They cannot control what refuses to react. And this is why silence becomes your greatest emotional boundary. Not revenge, not anger, not dramatic closure, but calm emotional withdrawal. Jung understood that true individuation begins when a person withdraws energy from unhealthy attachments. And without realizing it, your silence signals psychological awakening. You are choosing yourself. You are reclaiming emotional energy. You are ending unconscious patterns. And while for you silence feels like healing, for the narcissist it feels like loss of control. And this difference explains why they panic while you slowly find peace. Because your silence is not punishment, it is transformation. And transformation always threatens those who benefited from your previous suffering. The moment you stop chasing is the moment they realize they were never truly in control. They were only reacting to your willingness to stay. And now, for the first time, they must face a reality where you are no longer emotionally available. And that realization shakes them far more deeply than any argument ever could. After your silence continues, the narcissist enters a psychological phase few people understand. Because from the outside, they may appear calm, confident, even happier than before. But internally, a process begins that Carl Jung described as ego destabilization. The moment an external source of validation disappears, the false self begins searching desperately for restoration. And this is where the real panic starts. Not immediately, but gradually. Because narcissists first respond to silence with denial. They convince themselves you are only taking space. They assume you will eventually return like every other time. They replay memories where you forgave them, where you reached out first, where your empathy overpowered your boundaries. And they rely on this history to protect their ego from anxiety. But as time moves forward and your silence remains firm, denial slowly transforms into irritation. They begin wondering why you are not reacting, why their absence is not hurting you visibly, why you are not sending emotional messages anymore. And this irritates them deeply because narcissists interpret emotional withdrawal as loss of status. In their internal world, relationships are not mutual bonds, but psychological hierarchies. And when you stop chasing, the hierarchy reverses. Suddenly, they are the one without control. They are the one waiting, the one wondering, the one feeling uncertain, and uncertainty is emotionally intolerable for narcissistic personalities. Carl Jung believed that individuals avoid confronting their inner emptiness by controlling external environments. And you were part of that environment. Your emotional predictability stabilized their fragile identity. But now your silence introduces unpredictability. And unpredictability activates anxiety they cannot easily regulate. This is why many narcissists begin subtle attempts to re-enter your emotional space. They may watch your stories, like old posts. Send neutral messages, such as "How are you?" or "I was thinking about you." These are not random actions. They are psychological probes designed to test whether emotional access still exists. They want confirmation that your silence is temporary. Because if you respond emotionally, the internal panic immediately reduces. Your reaction restores familiarity. And familiarity restores control. But when no response comes, or when your reply remains calm, detached, and brief, the narcissist moves into a deeper stage of panic, known as narcissistic injury. This occurs when their self-image as irresistible or unforgettable begins to crack. They struggle to understand how someone who once loved them deeply could emotionally detach. Because narcissists believe their influence is permanent, they assume emotional dependency cannot disappear. And your silence directly challenges that belief. Jung described this moment as confrontation with the shadow self. The hidden insecurity, buried beneath grandiosity, begins to surface. Feelings of inadequacy, abandonment fear, and internal emptiness rise unexpectedly. But instead of processing these emotions consciously, narcissists attempt to escape them, and this is where sudden behavior changes appear. They may suddenly become affectionate, nostalgic, apologetic, or intensely attentive. What many people call love bombing after silence is actually a psychological survival strategy. They are not reconnecting from genuine self-awareness. They are attempting to regain emotional supply quickly before their internal instability grows stronger. They may say things they never said before, promise change, admit mistakes, or express vulnerability that feels unusually sincere. And this confuses many people because it appears like growth. But Jung warned that without true individuation, behavioral change often serves self-preservation rather than transformation. The narcissist fears losing access to the emotional energy you once provided. And when emotional supply disappears, their inner emptiness becomes louder. This is why silence affects them more deeply than confrontation ever did. Arguments kept emotional connection alive. Emotional connection meant control remained intact. But silence removes emotional feedback completely. And without feedback, the narcissist loses psychological orientation. They begin comparing new relationships to you, often idealizing you after losing access. Because distance allows them to rewrite memories selectively. They remember your loyalty, your patience, your understanding, but forget the pain they caused, and this selective nostalgia strengthens their desire to reconnect. Not necessarily to love differently, but to restore emotional familiarity. Many narcissists during this stage monitor you indirectly, asking mutual friends about you, checking updates secretly, attempting to understand whether you truly moved on. Because the most terrifying realization for them is not that you left. It is that you healed. Healing represents independence. And independence means their influence ended permanently. Carl Jung emphasized that psychological growth occurs when an individual withdraws projections and integrates their own identity. And your silence symbolizes exactly this process. You are no longer defining yourself through their reactions. You are no longer seeking validation from someone incapable of emotional reciprocity. And this inner shift changes how you appear energetically. Even without communication, your absence communicates strength. Your calmness communicates closure, and closure removes the emotional leverage they once held. At this point, the narcissist may escalate attempts to reconnect. Sometimes dramatically, sudden confessions, emotional messages late at night, unexpected apologies, or attempts to provoke jealousy. All designed to trigger emotional reaction. Because any reaction proves emotional access still exists. But if your silence remains grounded in self-respect, something profound happens. The narcissist begins experiencing emotional withdrawal, similar to addiction. Jung's understanding of attachment explains that repeated emotional reinforcement creates psychological dependency. And they became dependent on your attention more than they ever admitted. Your empathy regulated their emotions. Your forgiveness protected their ego. Your presence stabilized their identity. And without it, they experience restlessness, frustration, and internal discomfort they cannot easily explain. This is the hidden truth many people never see. The narcissist who once appeared powerful now feels psychologically destabilized, not because they lost love, but because they lost control over someone who finally chose emotional independence. And this realization creates the deepest panic of all, because for the first time, they recognize that you are capable of living peacefully without them. And nothing threatens a narcissist more than discovering they are no longer the center of your emotional world. As your silence continues and emotional distance becomes permanent, the narcissist reaches the final psychological stage, the stage most people never witness because it happens internally, quietly, beneath the surface of their confident appearance. Carl Jung believed that every human being eventually encounters a moment when illusion collides with reality. And for the narcissist, this collision happens when they finally understand that you are not coming back emotionally, not reacting, not waiting, not hoping, and not available anymore. This realization does not arrive suddenly. It emerges slowly, like a growing awareness they try desperately to resist. At first, they distract themselves with new attention, new conversations, new relationships, believing replacement will erase discomfort. But something unexpected happens. The emotional intensity they once felt with you cannot be recreated easily. Because your connection was never ordinary, you offered genuine presence, deep listening, emotional patience, and unconditional effort. Qualities that narcissists often take for granted while they exist, but struggle to replace once lost. Jung explained that individuals who rely on external admiration eventually face emotional emptiness when admiration becomes unstable, and your silence removes one of their strongest emotional anchors, forcing them into confrontation with themselves. This confrontation feels uncomfortable because it exposes a truth they avoided for years. That control is not love, attention is not intimacy, and admiration is not connection. And although they rarely admit it openly, your absence becomes a psychological mirror reflecting their own emotional limitations. Some narcissists respond to this moment by attempting one final return, often unexpectedly after months or even years. They reappear calmly, sometimes pretending nothing happened, sometimes presenting themselves as changed, wiser, or emotionally aware. This return is not random. It represents an attempt to reopen the emotional door that once guaranteed validation. They want to know whether they still exist emotionally within you, whether a small part of you still reacts, because if you respond emotionally, even slightly, hope of control returns instantly. But when your silence has evolved into true emotional detachment, something different occurs. You no longer feel urgency. You no longer feel the need to explain yourself, defend your decisions, or seek understanding. And this calm neutrality becomes the final message. Carl Jung described individuation as the process of becoming whole by reclaiming lost parts of oneself, and your silence completed that process. You withdrew emotional energy from a relationship that demanded constant sacrifice without mutual growth. You chose self-respect over emotional survival. And in doing so, you transformed from someone seeking love into someone embodying inner stability. And this transformation shifts the entire psychological dynamic. Because narcissists thrive where emotional dependency exists, but independence leaves no space for manipulation. At this stage, the narcissist may react in two opposite ways. Some attempt repeated reconnection cycles, sending occasional messages over long periods, unable to fully accept emotional closure, while others disappear completely, not because they forgot you, but because your silence forces them to confront feelings they cannot regulate. Avoidance becomes their defense against emotional discomfort. And many people misunderstand this disappearance as indifference. But psychologically, it often represents unresolved loss of control. Jung emphasized that what we cannot integrate, we attempt to escape, and rather than facing personal insecurity, the narcissist moves toward new environments where admiration feels easier. Yet even in new relationships, comparisons silently occur. Because your silence changed how they experienced emotional connection. You became the person who broke the familiar pattern. The person who stopped chasing, stopped explaining, stopped accepting emotional inconsistency. And this memory remains psychologically significant. Not as romantic longing, but as unfinished emotional tension. Meanwhile, something equally important happens within you. Healing deepens, emotional clarity strengthens, and the nervous system that once lived in confusion slowly learns peace. You begin noticing the absence of anxiety, the absence of constant overthinking, the absence of emotional exhaustion. And this peace feels unfamiliar at first, because chaos once felt normal. But Jung believed that true healing often feels quiet rather than dramatic. Growth rarely announces itself loudly. It appears as calm mornings, stable emotions, and the ability to exist without seeking validation from someone else's approval. Your silence was never about punishing another person. It was about ending unconscious emotional patterns. And once those patterns end, self-worth becomes internal rather than negotiated through relationships. This is why the narcissist's panic ultimately reveals an important truth. Their fear was never losing love. Their fear was losing influence. And when influence disappears, they must face themselves without distraction. While you move forward carrying lessons rather than wounds, the power dynamic reverses permanently. Because emotional power does not belong to the person who controls others. It belongs to the person who controls their own emotional availability. Carl Jung taught that the greatest victory in human life is not changing another person, but understanding oneself deeply enough to choose healthier paths. And your silence represents that victory. You recognized patterns that once trapped you. You reclaimed emotional boundaries that once felt impossible. And you learned that love without respect slowly erodes identity, while silence guided by self-awareness restores it. The narcissist panicked because your silence ended the illusion that they defined your emotional world. And once that illusion disappeared, they were left facing reality without the comfort of control. But for you, silence became liberation. Not emptiness, but renewal. Not rejection, but self-recognition. And perhaps the deepest lesson Jung offered is this. Healing begins the moment you stop chasing what continuously runs from genuine connection and peace.